Hello, good afternoon, everyone. Welcome back. As Maria said, my name is Sigrid Solnik. I'm the head of Estonian country office of Estonian Refugee Council. And I'm really thankful I have this opportunity to talk about anticipatory action over the course of this panel. What is anticipatory action, some of you might ask? To put it very simply, anticipatory action refers to actions taken to reduce the devastating impacts of different hazards before the devastation actually occurs, right? Or before its most acute impacts are felt. And in today's world, where we can predict all kinds of hazards, where we can monitor their emergence, where we can predict the impacts, it kind of makes sense to anticipate stuff and act before things happen. And in what follows, we will take the conflict situations in specific focus, as conflict is a significant driver of needs. Conflict is creating many of the situations where we actually need humanitarian interventions in the first place. But me, myself, I'm by no means an expert on anticipatory action. That's why I'm absolutely thrilled to have this color-coordinated duo of experts on the stage here. We have here Catalina Jaime, who's the head of Climate Centre at the International Federation of Red Cross and Red Crescent Societies. And we have Christina Bennett, CEO of the START Network, who gave us the sobering yet hopeful speech in the beginning of this conference. And what happens now, the game plan is that first I give the floor to our guests for opening remarks. This will be followed by a discussion here on the stage. And then everyone in the audience is very much welcome to join in. As the previous panel has shown, you are active question askers, so I think this is very important. I think it will be a good discussion also with all of you. And then in the end, we will have the closing words from the experts here. But and we have the Slido, as Maria said. So I will be checking it over the course of the next 1.5 hours. I will ask questions from there as well. And you will have the chance to take the mic then a bit later. But now, enough of me talking. We'll start with Catalina, please. How would you set the scene for the discussion?
Yeah. So I am so delighted to be here. When I received the invitation from ERA, I was like, yes, I have to go. This sounds really, I think this idea of a boutique conference sounds really attractive. So thank you so much. So just before getting into the anticipatory action world, my organization is called the Climate Centre, and it's a very beautiful organization because it started 22 years ago when nobody was talking about climate in the humanitarian sector. It was a tiny, tiny organization. And there was this amazing women who was like, we actually need to pay attention to climate in the humanitarian sector. We actually need to do something. So it's been really fascinating because for many, many, many years, we were like this tiny organization trying to develop tools and ideas. And what is really positive, talking about hope, is that we finally see how over the last relatively few years, the humanitarian sector is kind of reacting and say oh yes, actually, integrating climate risk and being a bit smarter at using information. It is what we need to do. So that's the organization, the Climate Centre. We are a reference center of the International Federation. We support the entire Red Cross and Red Crescent movement and many, many partners. So now, getting into the anticipatory action space, and I really love the panel earlier because I think what Juliet and all of you mentioned, it was we cannot forget the history of where we come from. It's just so important because now a lot of people is like, oh, anticipatory action is this like new thing. It's like the new buzzword. Like, no, let's make it clear. It is not. So I'm going to tell you a little bit of the background of the story, because I think it's so important that we just get it very clear, that we're talking just about an evolution of a concept. So starting with this, the tsunami. So I'm so glad, Julia, that you talk about the tsunami, because the tsunami really changed the game. And it changed the game for the world of early warning systems. It was the moment where we reacted. I was like, okay, what happened? Like, why all these deaths? Like, well, why the early warning system was not working? So the humanitarian system, with the governments, with everybody, can realize that we needed to change something. And then there was something like a very timely, very important conference at that time, the Hyogo conference in Japan about disaster risk reduction, in which early warning systems became a big priority. It was like, okay, we cannot let something like the tsunami happen again. So we need to really step up the game and make early warning systems better. So that was, we're talking about 2005. And then, of course, through that process, history, I mean, it was in the humanitarian sector in itself, that was not a thing. It was just like, okay, that's the government setting up the early warning systems, and development organizations like UNDP, for instance, very strong, and WMO somehow. But in the humanitarian sector, we're like, maybe this is not our business, maybe this is not what we need to do. And there was a very interesting moment, like particularly I remember like 2008, where some of my colleagues at the Climate Centre that were looking into the use of weather forecast and how can we really use forecast in the humanitarian sector. And there was actually the first moment where the Federation was like, okay, why don't we use this forecast in West Africa? Because it seems that there's going to be some floods. And why don't we use this DREF, which is our emergency fund, to do some early action? But it was like a very low-key thing there. And that happened in 2008, and then the Federation was like, oh, no, like, no, let's wait, this is too much. But something very special happened over the next like years, is that a lot of organizations started to kind of react and say, like, we actually could do better. Like, we could actually use weather forecasts, like, much, much better. And I remember being in Peru. I was working in Haiti in the earthquake response, and a lot of the disaster risk reduction work within the humanitarian sector started to get a little bit stronger. We started to, like, we were this like pocket of just very few people trying to do DRR in the context of the response. And of course, early warning systems were a thing, part of it. So in the framework of a lot of these very niche disaster risk reduction discussions at that time, the whole concept of basically being able to use forecasting of better weather kind of started to emerge in that like moment. And the reason why is related to three main gaps that we identified at that time. Like, well, why the early warning systems that's supposed to work are actually not working, and what can we do as humanitarians to maybe change that? So we identified three key things. So one was the decision-making process. Like, we didn't really have a process to say, like, oh, yes, we're going to act here. Because we could have the forecast, but then we didn't really understand the forecast. So there was this disconnection between the climate world and our world. So I think that was a big, and also the understanding of risk, like really trying to understand, like, who is more likely to be impacted by what. So that was one first gap that we said, okay, we need to be better at that. Then the second big one was the financing process. So we clearly knew that our funding as humanitarians is very limited, or was very limited, to the response. We get the money when the disaster happened. And the whole thinking at that time is like, how can we change that? How can we figure out a way that we can actually access to funding based on a forecast? And that was a wild idea. You know, but that was like, no way, this is gonna happen. I'll tell you a story how this changed. So that's the other. And then the other element was the planning process. Like, okay, what if I have the money? What if I have the forecast? But then what do I do? So of course, as humanitarians, we historically have been relatively decent at contingency planning. Like, contingency planning is a thing that we normally do in the context, but they were not really good. They were not really, really good. So that was the other thing. How can we take contingency planning to a next level. And it actually brings me to a point that, like, William, when you talk about the sphere standard this morning, it really kind of resonated with me, because although we didn't explicitly talk about the relationship between that anticipatory action process and the sphere standards, it is quite connected, because it was really about how do we plan in advance to be able to have, from one side, a better response that in a way is about the quality of the response, but also in that planning, which is like the big part of it, how can we reduce residual risks? Because of course we're not reducing all the risk, because we need the long-term investments for the big things that we need to do. But we're talking about that residual risk, like how do we minimize the loss of lives? How do we minimize like certain like impacts of disasters? So I think it resonates a lot with like what William was saying this morning. So we identified those gaps. We're like, okay, this is what we need to change. And that was like back in 2013, which was a very important moment, because the German Red Cross, with the Climate Centre, some of my colleagues at the Climate Centre that were really kind of visionary, they were kind of thinking, okay, how do we set up a finding mechanism to create these, and how do we set up the methodologies? And basically, one of these first very niche pilot projects like were funded, and then we started to develop the methodologies and the processes. But something that was very special at that time is that, of course, we were not like the Red Cross, we're not the only ones that were doing this. There was in parallel, of course, a lot of other humanitarian organizations, well, no, I wouldn't say a lot, some humanitarian organizations that were also kind of thinking at that moment, like how do we transform the system? And it was just a very important milestone moment in 2015 when the START network and WFP, in a way funded by the German government, like to be honest, I feel the German government had really the vision. They were like, okay, let's fund this thing. That kind of makes sense. And basically, everything started. Why? Because there was a creation of a community. So the German government really put the money of creating that community that will move everything and that will check up the system. And of course, the money to be able to set up the projects and the systems. And so we started to address, in a way, those gaps on the way. And I think the first big thing that happened, and it was like, I mean, it's crazy. It's like really recent, like 2018, like between like 2017, 18, 19, it was such a key moment in terms of a big change, because all the humanitarian organizations, like big picture, basically, starting with the START Network, the Red Cross, and the UN, the CERF, we all created the anticipatory action windows that didn't exist before. It was like the first time that basically we said, like, okay, we have these funds to do early action based on a decision-making process, based on a plan. So it's fantastic. So when we talk about, how loom and how difficult and the challenges that we have, I think this is an example of how things have actually changed positively over the last few years. So that's great. Now, I'm getting into the conflict part, no worries. So I think that's the starting point of like how do we achieve the system, and how do we come a little bit more anticipatory, trying to use the better data that we have. And I think we started to create a lot of these different projects and trying to really coordinate as much as we could. And there was a moment personally where I was just like working all these different national societies and setting up the systems. And I was like, okay, there is a basic gap that we're not covering. And it was basically reaching conflict-affected population. So most of our Red Cross, and I will say the general humanitarian agencies that were starting to do anticipatory action, we were not really reaching those areas affected by conflict. So most of the systems were on the safer areas. And this is either on just the safer part of the country that is actually not affected by conflict, or not on the country that is fully affected by conflict, like anticipatory action in Afghanistan, just until very recently kind of started. So me, coming from Colombia, I started like my humanitarian career in an IDP operation in Colombia, but also responding to floods. For me, that was like, I had very clear that connection. I was like, okay, we have people affected by conflict that on the top of that are suffering from climate impacts. I'm like, there is something wrong with our anticipatory action systems. We are not really getting to the people that need it the most. So then that's, at that time, then I started to lead a lot of the work on anticipatory action in conflict settings. And the other part that was very interesting is that, and this really enters into the politics of the Red Cross in a way, is that, of course, the Federation was the one leading on a lot of this topic, because Federation, responsibility, disasters, while the RCRC, which is the one who, you know it, deals with conflict, they were no part of the equation. Like, it was the Federation business, but not the RCRC business. And just by coincidence, at that time, I started to lead the partnership with the International Committee of the Red Cross to integrate climate risk into their work. So it was like the perfect opportunity. I was like, okay, this is the moment to try to expand. So now, just to finalize, what I think at that moment, when we started to think, and a lot with the START network, with your colleagues, we started to think, well, how do we tackle this issue of like conflict? And there were kind of like two elements to it. So one was to anticipate hydrometeorological events in a conflict setting. Like, could be a refugee camp or like a really deep, difficult to access area. But then there was the other topic, it was like the anticipation of conflict. And so we tackle this topic in a way in parallel. And most of the attention, most of what we have been trying to do is advance the first one, because it's like the very obvious, we just need to get to those places. The one of anticipating conflict has been more difficult. And I think one of the key positions at this moment within the Anticipation Hub, with a lot of the work that we are doing among different organizations, and actually OCHA has done a really great job on this, I would say, is that the current anticipatory action system that we have is not fit for purpose to be able to anticipate a conflict. I think the decision-making processes, in a way that foresight, we are not there. Like, it's quite complex. I do see that it's something that is advancing, and I think the key focus that we have is how to anticipate the humanitarian impacts of conflict. And this is kind of very straightforward, talking about displacement. So a lot of the effort on that is like, so we're not predicting the conflict per se, but we know the impacts. How can we be better at anticipating that displacement? And I think what I find very important in this is that it's about the dignity of being able to provide an excellent response if we anticipate it properly. So, thank you.
Thank you. A lot of things were said that we will talk about in more depth. But how would you set the scene for?
Great, thanks, Sigrid, and thanks for that history. I actually didn't know some of that, so it's really great to hear it coming from you. And I do remember, for me at least, in like 2017, 2018, that moment where this question about anticipatory action became an urgent one. And for me, it wasn't because of START Network. I wasn't there yet. I was working for the Overseas Development Institute at the time, and we were seeing this drought, this famine evolve in Somalia, a famine that was completely recognizable, completely familiar, completely predictable, because it had happened in 2011. And back in 2011, everyone was saying, never again will we allow this to happen in Somalia. And here we were in 2017, 2018, and it was happening again. Why? Because we hadn't bothered to do the predictive analytics, to put in place the financing to avoid it a second time. And so it became very clear to all of us that this was an urgent situation. Well, Catalina has really outlined very well the kind of areas that we've all been working on in this space around, how do we assess risk? How do we use our information to assess risk? How do we provide the financing along the lines of anticipatory action? And how do we need to change ourselves to be able to do it? And how do we plan? Because acting early, anticipating whether it's the effects of conflicts or the effects of climate hazards, it requires the prepositioning of plans and knowing who's going to do what, when, where, in that sort of, humanitarian response mode that we're always in. So what I'll start to do now is talk a little bit about what we're doing at START Network, because we are implementing, I think, a lot of the ideas that you put forward, and together with partners such as the IFRC, such as WFP, such as the UN, we're all trying to do this a bit in concert, because it will take a whole of sector approach, I think, to get this right. So you heard a little bit this morning about what START Network is. And that sort of common frustration we have about the way aid is delivered, that we think it really does need a rethink. And part of what we're thinking about that is that we need to change the way the world responds to disasters. So the first part is the response. We are always in reactive mode when we could be acting early based on the knowledge that we have about how these things occur in cycles. We wait until there are headlines in the news to really mobilize our forces against certain to mitigate certain disasters, and we don't need to be so reactive. The second is that we are late. Again, we wait for the headlines, we wait for declarations of emergencies, whatever it is that we do, our money and our action is always too late to really make a difference in communities. They're already in the midst of it by the time our money gets on the ground, which is sometimes weeks, but more often months, to be able to affect things. And third, and this is really important to me and the work that we're doing at START Network, is we miss opportunities for communities to lead. We know communities, local organizations, they are there. They are there, they are able to act quickly. They are also of the community, so they really understand the risks and vulnerabilities associated with certain hazards because they live there and they have the resources and the networks at their disposals. They should be the ones leading these anticipatory practices and not necessarily us. So in any case, we know that there's a better way of doing this. We know that we should be shifting our thinking, not in all cases, but in many cases, away from meeting needs. We talked about needs a lot this morning. We don't always have to be meeting needs. We should also be addressing risks. And by addressing risks, we are protecting people ahead of a crisis instead of responding to their suffering afterwards. So at START Network, we've spent a few years developing this risk-based approach based on the information you were talking about, based on how do we determine risks, how do we pre-position the financing, and how do we plan. And we do this through, I guess, three sort of complementary financial tools. I call this our family of funds and financial instruments because we have three of them now. We're always adding more, but we try to we try to layer them in such a way where they're addressing different aspects of a response or different aspects of a hazard at different times. And I really find that, given the conversations we were having this morning, that this is an area for optimism. This is a bright spot in our sector. This is where different actors are coming together to really move the needle on change in a way that we haven't seen probably in a generation. So it's a very exciting area, I think, in knowing that we can change when we want to. So our three instruments are the following. We have our START funds. They're basically pooled funds like the Central Emergency Response Fund of the UN, like the DREF at the Red Cross. It's a pooled fund, right? That is mainly a rapid response fund. And we use that fund to respond to emergencies that we cannot predict in that very traditional rapid response humanitarian way. We try to do it as early as possible, and we try to do it as quickly as possible. And I think we get money, we make decisions about funding in 72 hours, and money is usually on the ground within a couple of weeks, depending on the banking systems. But increasingly, and to your point, a few years ago, we opened up an anticipation window. So I think at this point, I think it's 22% of the START fund is now allocated in advance of a crisis when we can predict it. And crisis predictability comes in different forms. A cyclone, you can only really predict a few days in advance. A drought, you can predict months in advance. An earthquake, not really at all, maybe a few hours. So, the predictability, it varies from crisis to crisis, but we try to use the START fund as much as possible for that sort of very, very anticipatory action with things that we can predict. We also have a second instrument, which is called Start Ready. And what it does is sort of in the name. It is a pooled funding mechanism, but that also pools risks and pre-positions funding and pre-positions plans based on triggers for emergencies when they happen. So for example, if we are operating, Start Ready operates now in 9 countries. And in those 9 countries, we have modeled different risks. So we model floods, we model droughts, we model windstorms. And based on the models that we've developed for those risks, we set triggers. Based on those triggers, we pre-position funds to be able to respond if those triggers are met. And based on the money that we pre-position, we put together contingency plans with our members so that when the trigger is met and the fund is released, we can get to work as soon as possible. So that's our second one. It is a little bit more rigid than the START fund, so we can't react to things that are going on. We have countries that we pre-position funding in every single year. We have this yearly process of where we pre-position funds. But what's interesting about Start Ready is that, for example, we're holding now, I think 9 million funds in our risk pool, 9 million pounds in our risk pool. But we can actually stretch those funds to 13 or 14 million, meaning we can hold 9 million worth of funds, but be able to protect 14 million worth of risks, because we calculate that not all of those risks are going to trigger at the same time. So it is a little bit of a way of making more efficient use of the limited funds we have. And then our third product is parametric insurance, and we primarily use this in Africa. We buy insurance from something called the Africa Risk Capacity, which is a sort of an arm of the Africa Union. It's a public-private insurance program. And we buy that insurance for sort of rarer and larger scale events. So right now we have insurance in Somalia, in Senegal, and in Zimbabwe, mainly for droughts and floods. And the insurance, again, pays out based on a trigger, a pre-agreed trigger that we agree with ARC, and ahead of a risk actually happening. And as I said earlier, what we try to do is we take these three funding mechanisms and we try to mix and match them and layer them in a way that covers all aspects of a risk that we see. So, for example, in Somalia, in February 2023, so February of last year, there was a poor rainy season, and following that poor rainy season, it triggered the drought. So it anticipated a drought coming probably 6 months later. That trigger actually released the insurance that we had bought for Somalia, and we were paid out $3.8 million in insurance money to be able to pay for an early response in February ahead of a June drought. At the same time, we released our own kind of mechanism, Start Ready, also triggered, and we were able to release £700,000 from our own funds to work alongside that insurance payout. So that was $4.2 million for early response in Somalia to a predicted drought. And then we had our contingency plans that we'd already done with our local, national, and international members, and everybody got to work. Mainly cash was distributed from April until June, and then we did an evaluation afterwards of how that all went. And the evaluation results were really positive. So, you know, the distribution of the cash had been effective. People who had been pre-selected to receive that funding did receive it. Somali households were able to increase their meals during the drought. So we did this evaluation in October after the sort of summertime drought. And they were able to increase their meals from what had traditionally been 1 meal a day to 2 meals a day. The household hunger scores increased by 40%, and most aid recipients reported little or no hunger compared to the last drought. And some households, because they had received the cash ahead of time, had done things like saved their livestock, managed to pre-position other types of household items, and were able to repay debts. So at the end of the drought, they were actually better off than before the drought had occurred. So what we're trying to do now is just to really deepen the quality of our models and produce more evidence to constantly sort of put pressure on governments and other aid organizations to be thinking about anticipation as much as possible so that it becomes another tool in the humanitarian toolbox and we're not always reliant on this question of response. Just maybe one point about conflict, because you raised it and because it's the title of the session, about anticipating conflict. So the examples I just gave you from Start Network are mainly about climate-related hazards. We've spent a lot of our time building the models, building the triggers for climate hazards, and not conflict. And there are a few reasons for that. One, conflict itself is very difficult to predict. There's not a way of building a trigger for conflict because there's so many different levels of confluence of forces that come together in a conflict setting. And it's even more difficult to really predict the humanitarian impacts of conflict in a way that would allow us to contingency plan meaningfully. And then there are serious sort of moral and ethical considerations around predicting conflict. You know, if you start you start sort of putting out sensitive information about conflict dynamics, you're potentially putting people at risk just in doing that, aggravating tensions, provoking conflict where there may not have been tensions in the first place. And then we were talking about the do no harm principle this morning, but I feel very strongly that there is a do no harm principle in operation here, because if we start predicting things like displacement, our country's going to close borders. You know, if we start forecasting, intercommunal violence in a particular area, our government's going to then mobilize troops. If we start prepositioning funding, giving money to one community and not to another because we predicted conflict over there, that's just going to increase the intercommunal violence. So we have to be really careful about predicting things that are likely mostly unpredictable, but also that could do more harm than good. Thanks.
Thank you. We will go into the conflict part of anticipatory action in a second, but it just I would like to ask out loud this question that if we earlier this morning, I think Christina, you said 55% of stuff happening is predictable, and there has been this never again sentiment. And there is the proof that anticipatory action prevents suffering and it works. Then why are we still late and reactive, and why it's not as mainstream as it should or could be?
Yeah, I give a go on that. I think it's a complex kind of question, in the sense that, like, there is one world of anticipatory action that is happening in areas that are more easy to operate in a way. So I will say that is advancing. So I think the big humanitarian agencies are really trying to deliver. So it is little by little, they're like moving forward. But when we talk about these like really difficult to access areas, that's where we get into the challenge part in a way. Like it's really very difficult to operate. And there are a couple of reasons, like why. So I'm going to concentrate on that aspect of like conflict, like the complexities of really working on these areas. And I think like one is that decision-making process. So we're talking about areas that do not have necessarily hydrometeorological infrastructure. Like why? Because they have been either in a protracted conflict, or because of security, hydromet stations are even damaged, or hydromet staff is not able to go there to repair them and to maintain them. So that's a big gap, because if we look at our capacity to forecast, in big, large territories, normally hydromet departments will have, in a way, better forecast for the areas where they have more meta stations. But in those areas that do not have meta stations, of course, it's way more difficult. So we have a starting point, very patchy complication there. And that's one element of the decision-making process. Then we talk about risk understanding, and like that really clear idea, who is more likely to be impacted, why. That's also difficult, because we don't necessarily have all the different pieces of the puzzle of the data in those very, very complex areas. So I think that is definitely one aspect. Then the other big element, and I think this morning the panel talked about like that very well, is that element of like access, and that difference between who can access to certain territories, certain, let's say, protection-related agencies, versus maybe the rest of the humanitarian sector that access other areas. And I think a lot of the protection-related agencies, and I'm speaking like the International Committee, as I said before, like anticipatory action for them is like, it was not a thing. It was like, no, this is not our business. Like we're doing conflict, like we're not doing climate, which fortunately is changing. And I'll tell you a story later on, but that is a little bit kind of improving. But that was definitely a big issue. Like we do have a lot of humanitarian organizations that do mostly protection-related work that are not really like keen on integrating, something new within the work that they are doing. So I think these are like some of the kind of, I'm just kind of touching the surface of like some of the challenges of like, why is it so difficult to operate? I think this morning as well, I think this relates a lot to the ethical conversation. Because, clear, I think, William, you mentioned also this morning that there are like 500 non-state art groups in the world, in different areas, with like millions of people just in those areas. So being able to act ahead of a disaster in those areas requires a change on how do we interact with non-state armed groups. And that's a big deal, because it's like, for the ICRC, okay, that's where actually they have such a big role on anticipatory action in conflict areas. But if we are talking about other organizations that do not necessarily interact with non-state armed groups, but that do they have anticipatory action systems? So then there is a dilemma, like, what do we do? Like, how do we start to actually talk to them? Like, shall we? Or should we? So I think that is one of these big issues. And then the last one that I would say, which to me, like, I started actually to do a PhD on this topic, so because of this, so I was like really intrigued of like trying to understand much better like why we're not able to do it and what we could do to be able to do it. And one of the realities of conflict areas is that the power of local organizations is quite big. At the end, they are the ones who can deliver, like in the very complex areas. And I say it from my own country. Like, I know they were just those local organizations that were the ones who were able to just like access and do actually work. The current anticipatory action systems that we have are not kind of fit for purpose for that, because it's very institutional. So we have, these big funds, within our organizations, and we have our plans, and we have all these things, but like that level of coordination, of connection with the local organizations that are tiny, like very small in certain areas, we are not quite there. So that's kind of like what we call the standard operational procedures or our early action protocols. They don't necessarily are getting into that coordination with those organizations, which at the end, we know they are the ones who know very well who are the different non-state armed groups. How do you deal with the politics of those particular territories? So I think we have a long way to go to figure out how do we understand and work better with those local organizations, and also the big question mark that anticipatory action is not only about having the funding for the early action, but it is about setting up the systems to be able to do it. Because we could have the money, great, but if you don't have the system on the ground to be able to actually do it, then we don't have anything. I think that's the key point.
Yeah, no, and I would just come in. I would agree. I think that when you're looking at fragile and conflict-affected states or states actively in conflict, you just don't. There are no systems. There are no government systems. Civil society is unable to operate. There are access issues, as we know, and so therefore, putting together these very sort of systemic level changes, this anticipatory action requires that a lot of systems are in place. So I think it is up to organizations like ours to help set that up ahead of time. And while I was saying that START Network mainly works in natural hazards when it comes to anticipatory action, we do anticipate the effects of conflict. So we will work on cholera epidemics following a conflict, for example, or we will anticipate election violence if there's an election. So we do try to anticipate certain aspects and effects of conflict in conflict areas, but always working through civil society to make up for the fact that in those areas, the infrastructure has broken down. But I guess I would cite maybe a few other things as to why this hasn't gone to scale, why we're just not doing it all the time. And the first is obviously going to be about funding. I think there was a recent report that said that 1.1% of humanitarian funding is going to anticipatory action. And meanwhile, we're saying that not only are 55% of all emergencies somewhat predictable, 25% of that 55% is also modelable in the way that you can actually model a trigger that will tell you if something's going to happen or not. So whatever your envelope is for humanitarian response, you should be using those calculations to decide what you should be doing, how much money you should be giving to anticipatory action. And there are a few reasons why the funding isn't there, and one of them is politics, right? Responding to an emergency is much sexier than averting one. Can you imagine a headline in the local newspaper saying, "Disaster averted in Bangladesh"? No, of course not. We are heroically going into Bangladesh, and we as a government are showing with our flag on the food delivery that we are good government, that we are part of the international community, that we are heroic in helping a community get out of disasters. So it is just politically much more palatable to respond than to act ahead of time. There's also this idea, we all pool funds and pool risks, which basically says to a donor, you can't tell us where the money is going to go. We're going to tell you where the money is going to go, and that's based on needs and risks and all sorts of scientific calculations that we're doing. But a lot of donors are not happy with that. A lot of donors don't want to see their money going to certain countries, or they want to direct a lot of their funds to other countries. And so this whole idea of pooling, whether you're talking about anticipatory action or even just response, is still a big barrier for those donors. Finally, there's this idea that we called no regrets funding. So when you give money to the Start Ready, for example, the Start Network kind of risk pool, you're giving us money on the prediction that a disaster might happen. And we are holding on to that money for the entire year on the prediction that a disaster might happen. And we hope it doesn't happen. That would be good news, that the disaster doesn't happen or things don't trigger. But that means your money isn't spent. And the humanitarian sort of funding model is that money has to be spent in a year, in 2 years, whatever your contract is for, the money has to be spent. So if it just sits around and isn't spent, number one, your accountants in your ministry are not going to like that. But number two, that money is money that's not being spent on humanitarian response. And they see it as kind of a zero-sum game. There's an opportunity cost with Start Network holding on to money for a year that could be spent elsewhere. So there's a whole issue around that. There's also an evidence gap, and we've talked about that a little bit. We haven't practiced this really long enough to be able to have the right level of evidence to prove that anticipatory action is more efficient, more effective, and more impactful. We have inklings of that. I just described what we did in Somalia. That's like one small little operational evaluation that we did. We don't have that at scale. So we just need to practice this more to be able to deliver the evidence base and to convince people to fund. And as humanitarian practitioners, like not on the donor side, but on our side, we're not necessarily skilled for this. Humanitarians are generalists, right, mainly. And what anticipatory action requires to do well is a knowledge of, modeling risks and how to translate scientific data into actionable information that you can use. And so our institutions don't necessarily have that skill set already within us. We have to hire that out. We have, at Start Network, we rely on some global consultants. We've actually hired risk modelers internally now. And now we're relying on local meteorological organizations or academic institutions to tell us what we need to know. But we don't have the skills to do that within ourselves as traditional humanitarian organizations. That's what I would say.
Can I jump in?
Yeah.
Let's go back to the politics of this, because I think we need to unpack the challenges deeper in this. And it really makes me think about the tragedy that we are seeing in Valencia now. So unacceptable, so absolutely unacceptable. And it really is a lot about the politics of it. And one of the things that we have, that we know of, why so many deaths, in Valencia, which is a city that is so advanced and it's incredible. And it was really a big political issue that basically trickled down on the lack of communication. The forecast was there. It was clearly, there was a forecast, but it was really the system that was not set up to be useful to use the forecast. And we are seeing this in Spain, relatively, a very advanced country in terms of systems. But I think there is a political problem on not prioritizing early warning systems, or not being able to set up, the protocols that they needed to set up, for all the agencies that should be part of the whole system to discuss. So we're seeing that's a challenge. So it's a planetary challenge that we have, why we're not able to use or apply early warning systems better / anticipatory action. And one of the big things as well that we see at governmental level in the early warning systems is that they do not have the funding mechanism for early action. I think that's one of the big things that we are trying to do. So it's a fascinating thing, because if you have this tiny humanitarian sector, compared to the big governments, that's setting up the anticipatory action systems, and we have our funding mechanisms, but that's, in a way, it's not necessarily a drop in the ocean, but it's little, compared to what the governments actually can do with their early warning systems. And one of the things that we're trying to do from a humanitarian perspective, working with a lot of the governments, is like, look, we set up these systems. Like you should actually create financing mechanisms within like your financing systems to be able to anticipate. So I think that's a big gap. Like the governments do not have yet their actually capacity to use their funds for that. And that needs to change to really be able to get to the big scale that, that is needed. And another last point related to this, and I think this is very important to demystify it, is the expectations about anticipatory action. Like, anticipatory action has a limit. Like, we will be able, in the humanitarian sector, to tackle certain risk. But I think that narrative that has been a little bit created, that, in my opinion, and being a person that has been so involved in this, that is so inflated of like, anticipatory action is going to save the world, and it's just going to reduce all the risk in the world. Like, no. There is a role, it is important, very, very concrete for certain particular risk, but it is not the ultimate. So what you were saying about how the STAR network is kind of like tackling the whole kind of layers of risk is great, because it is not about the anticipatory action bit, but it's about all the different layers of solutions that we need to create to tackle basically the risk across all the time scale.
Maybe if we are already talking about, or as we are already talking about politics, another topic I would like to throw in this is refugees, IDPs, and anticipatory action, which is could be very political. Can, I don't know, either of you a bit elaborate on this, or like how, in the context of refugees, for example, how is anticipatory action used, and what might be the also political challenges in that?
Yeah, I think so. This kind of goes back to the point, I think, about making sure that, and especially in fragile and conflict-affected states, that you're working through local organizations as much as possible, and it potentially refugee-led organizations or refugee populations in country. And I say that because, you know, what gets overlooked in some of this anticipation work are the really marginalized communities, either because we can't get there, or because our members don't cover those areas, or because governments have never really modeled risks in those communities because they sort of forget about them. So we don't have the data, we don't have the evidence, we don't have the access, and we don't have the ability to work there, which is why we try as much as possible to work through communities, not only to model the risks, but to also action the contingency plans when the risks are triggered. I think, you know, depending on whether it's like an IDP situation or a refugee camp situation, I think you'd operationalize that differently. I think an IDP situation, you need to be talking to the community, including the IDPs in that community, about what risks they see. They're going to have different risks and vulnerabilities than the host population, and you have to look at those groups in concert and be able to speak to communities of all sorts in order to be able to model the risks and then act on the risks. So I think it's just about really making sure that we are like globally connected in what we do, but very, very highly locally positioned in anticipating, in developing models, in triggering risks, and in pre-positioning the funds for it. Because if we're not locally positioned, we're going to miss out on the very populations that need us most.
So for me, this is a topic that is quite close to my heart. And I mentioned to you before, like one of my first humanitarian response operations was in the north of Colombia, in a flood that was horrendous, that affected like so many IDPs. It was just like classic scenario, like IDPs along the river in this region called Apartado, massive flood, absolute destruction, like really traumatic. And like for me, that's like so unacceptable. Like, no, this can absolutely not happen. Like, why no people have to be have these kind of layers of suffering, one on top of each other. So it's something that I'm working quite a lot with my team. So one thing that we're doing now, which is quite interesting, we wanted to understand to what extent IDPs and refugees globally are exposed to climate hazards? Because that's a big question. Like, we don't really know. So we have done this gigantic analysis to try to understand, like, all these big refugee camps and IDP camps, like, to what extent are they exposed? And like, one of the big figures that basically most of them are exposed to one hazard, but many of them are actually exposed to 2 to 3 hazards. And we're talking about floods, heat waves, and others. So the problem is there. Like, we do have a gigantic exposure of like millions of people that are in these settings. Then the questions are, is the humanitarian system that is supporting those settings ready for anticipatory action? No. And I think that's very worrying. Like, we are not. So one of the big things, like, we're actually writing this moment, like a sort of like toolkit, focusing on this topic of like, how can we support, the humanitarian system to be able to do more anticipatory action in IDPs and refugee settings. And like, one of the big things is like, we need to work better with the cluster system. Like, the role of the CCCM cluster and the shelter cluster is so big there, because they have like a big kind of opportunity to be able to integrate within the systems that they have, the use of forecast, a better decision-making process, how to utilize the funds that are out there. So I think that it's evolving. So I see the conversations evolving in that area, but we are still far of really having this, the system set up. Like, one maybe optimistic view on this, which I'm like very excited about, is that the UK had a big investment on improvement of weather services. And one of the things that we worked with them over the last few years was to design their climate services program for the Middle East, for the MENA region. And we managed basically to kind of work with them to make sure that that entire program is focusing on IDPs and refugees, the entire program. And that's so incredible. So there is a lot of work in the Middle East. If you have any work in the Middle East, I think this is a great opportunity to try to figure it out, how we can be better at the use of climate services in the region.
But I think with the refugees and IDPs, it's also the response is connected to what are their rights in that place. Like, can the structures be permanent, or they're just like the first flood will take them away? Are we allowed to improve the structures of living or the housing so that they would be better prepared for a disaster? Or can we move people away from the floods, or they don't have the right to move? And all these like very political issues, I think. But from here, I wanted to move to the conflict setting, like to another side of the conflict setting. You said that anticipatory action in conflict settings, we don't have the system in place. There are a lot of risks connected to that part, or to that questions, difficult to predict, etc. And we have here one question from the audience, and I will just read it out loud, is the info about the high possibility of the full-scale invasion of Ukraine was published months and months before it actually took place. What do you think, how well was the humanitarian community ready to respond? Like, were we ready? Was there any anticipatory action taken or not? Or what are your thoughts on this?
I can go if you want. So it was not ideal. Like, I remember so clear many of my colleagues trying to kind of set up the systems to receive the refugees. So in a way, yes, like there was a lot of like movement. Like, many of your organizations probably were at the forefront of like setting up the systems in the different kind of like neighboring countries in advance. So yes, there was a level of anticipatory action, I would say. Did we have the absolute optimal level where we had the financing mechanism that was triggered based on the information and we had a very clear plan? No, I don't think so. It was a little bit more fluid in a way. So, which actually brings me to an important point, is that to anticipate the impacts of conflict, we cannot use the current very standard kind of rigorous anticipatory action mechanisms that we have for weather related events, but there is this need of a very kind of flexible, adaptable approach, because of course the contexts are going to be so fluid and so different. So I think overall, there is a lot of learning that we should do of Ukraine, and look at Sudan, like Sudan and other contexts. So I think there is, and going back maybe, Julia, to your point, I think there is, we should do more of that. Maybe we can work with Anna for working a little bit about this. There is a need, because we have to learn from it, because we need to do it. And I think one important kind of topic in terms of the vision of humanitarian action is that, sadly, because we are in terrible climate crisis, like what we are seeing at the moment with the climate, sadly, is just the tip of the iceberg of what is coming in the next years. I mean, I'm like, yeah, it sounds dramatic, but it is true. So we really need to figure out a way, how do we become like better, not only at responding at these kind of climate-related disasters, but to the cascading effects of all that. And of course, big question mark, the potential tensions and different things that, you know, society might have as a result of this compound crisis.
So what I would say to that is less about how do we anticipate conflict, or how did we didn't even think about anticipating a conflict in a place like Ukraine at Start Network. But, you know, in my previous role at ODI, I had written about Ukraine since 2014. So the international community was in Ukraine since 2014, since the first invasion of Crimea then. And there was a bit sort of a bubble, or like a moment of interest in Ukraine at that time, and the ICRC was there, and a few local sort of regional organizations went in and helped. But it very, very soon became a non-event, and the humanitarian community lost interest. And I remember at the time calling it a frozen conflict. It was a conflict that was ongoing. It had no interest from the international donor community, and only very limited interest from the international aid organizations, who were also finding it hard to work in Russian-held areas. And it just wasn't on anyone's radar. And, you know, what people would say to me, because we were advocating for more attention on Ukraine when I was at this think tank, people would say to me, Christina, we've got, 35 other emergencies going on at the same time. We can't be everywhere. This is sort of parked in the background until we need to, and then we saw what happened. So I think it comes back to the question we had earlier. Is it about how do we de-link our involvement in conflicts? How do we de-link that from strategic priorities, from funding priorities, from the fact that if we see needs, if we see things happening, how are we able to at least shine a light on them, highlight the fact that they're going to happen, without waiting for the massive amounts of funding to come in that compel us then to go into Ukraine, which now, was flooded with organizations, was flooded with money in February of 2022, when the work could have been ongoing in conflict prevention activities until then. I don't think it's humanitarians' job to be preventing conflict in places like that. There are plenty of conflict prevention actors that should have been working in Ukraine long before that exploded in February of 2022.
Okay, and it's another question from the audience, also from Birgit. The difference and the similarities, or maybe still the differences between the anticipatory action and conflict prevention. Like, what are we preventing? Are we preventing the conflict, or are we preventing the impacts of the conflict on a population, right? And we shouldn't maybe mix these two things, or what do you...
Yeah, that's very clear. I think that's very clear in a way. We set up this working group, 2019, and that was the big question. No, it was like, okay, what do we do with this topic? And I think it's very clear, like predicting conflict to minimize conflict is not our business. That's a very another territory that is very complex, because first, in terms I think you were referring to this, there are a lot of ethical considerations behind that, in terms of even the modeling and the data that is going into this is not ready for it. So I think that really, like preventing conflict by using all these different like tools that are available. I think we are not quite yet there. There is a lot of investment, huge investment on this area. Like it's a fascinating kind of territory, and particularly with that kind of angle of climate security. So there's a lot of work going on. And then on the other area, which is that, again, like the anticipation of the impacts of conflict, that's where we are working more. That's kind of like the space where we are starting to explore and trying to kind of like become better. Of course, building on a lot of the work of many, many years. It's not like a new thing. Like I remember in Colombia, like so clearly, there was this local, like, national organization that used to like they have a massive monitoring of displacement in the country. And I remember we receiving the information of like, oh, these communities from these areas are displacing to these areas. And we were trying to, move and set up the systems. No, the problem is that, of course, it was very ad hoc, very kind of like setting up and running. And that's where we need to become better. Like it should not be ad hoc. It should not be just like on the spot planning, but we should plan in advance. We should have the systems. We should have the money to be able to do that properly.
Yeah, I would say anticipatory action is not conflict prevention. And in fact, as I was saying earlier, it could be conflict exacerbation. So I don't think we should be conflating the two at all. I think anticipatory action, like all of the things that we're talking about this entire day, has got to be one tool in a very large toolbox that's about, reducing vulnerability, building up community resilience, putting the Band-Aid on the wound, but also societal transformation in the places that we want to see do better. So there's so much to be doing in any one of these given contexts that anticipatory action, like humanitarian response, like development, like conflict prevention, is just one tool, and we need the mix of all of those tools to come together to really, to really protect populations and reduce vulnerability where we're working. Anyway.
A point on that, because I really love what you just said, which I think is very important. Like going back to the history again of the anticipatory action. Like, and maybe you don't know it, but the first anticipatory action projects started as part of these larger disaster risk reduction and climate change adaptation projects. It was so beautiful because it was this like large, amazing project. It was in Uganda, and I was like the delegate implementing it. And it was just really cool CCA project with DRR, with a lot of like community work, with like big investments on like mitigation activities. And then it has like that little bubble, really nice, of what we used to call forecast-based financing, which is the same thing, anticipatory action. And it was so nice. It was just so great because it really looked at the big picture of like how do we do different actions that will at the end help society's well-being. And I think there was a political decision at a certain moment of just kind of like retract from that kind of big picture and then just focus on the anticipatory action element, because we needed to push for that. We needed to change the system. So we just said, okay, like let's just concentrate on just kind of like selling the picture of anticipatory action. So we just kind of like focus, and then that's why the donors started to fund more of these very niche forecast-based financing anticipatory action processes. But I think now, after kind of so many years of that, and finally kind of like the humanitarian embracing the idea of using data and information, I do feel that we need to go back to the basics again. And like, start again from zero. Like, let's fund the big, like really projects that we need, or programs that need to tackle all these different risks across time scales, having the anticipatory action or early warning systems part of it.
Yeah, and I think what we're saying too is the role of anticipatory action in these very, very tense and fragile contexts is anticipating the impacts on communities, right? So if you're not anticipating the conflict itself, but you're anticipating a cholera epidemic that you know will happen in that community in a conflict setting because it's happened before. We have historical data, we have health data. And that's like some of the stuff we fund at Start Network is a cholera epidemic in a conflict in Somalia, because we know historically that it will happen. So after we do our analysis, we try to anticipate by funding, interventions early, clean water delivery, or upskilling health workers, or awareness campaigns around cholera. in anticipation of that happening in a conflict setting. So there are absolutely things that we can do to reduce the destructive effects a conflict has on people by anticipating them, but we cannot anticipate, we're not preventing any of this from happening in the first place.
And maybe a point to that, which I think is like the new, obviously like the new trend in terms of the discussions on anticipatory action, is like, how do we move from anticipating that very kind of like single specific event, like the flood or the cholera epidemics and this, to really look at the system, because at the end risks are fluctuating, so they just move. And then I think what we need to move forward is to develop processes that don't only kind of monitor one specific like hazard, but really look at other multiple risks and kind of like look into systems that look at kind of movements of displacement, epidemics, natural hazards, and so on and so forth, which is very difficult, like super, super difficult. Like trying to set up kind of like systems like these that help us to kind of like take decisions in different moments of time instead of this kind of like singular process. So there's a lot of kind of thinking and kind of brainstorming of how can we do that, and that's where kind of AI enters into the equation, which is kind of like, I think the next panel is quite interesting in that, because that's the big question. Like, there is so much data, there is just like so much complexity. Like, can at some extent like AI kind of help us to navigate those decision-making processes and kind of like integrating a lot of like these different kind of sets of information? We don't know. So maybe we'll find out later.
Inshallah. I would now open up the floor for questions. Okay, I can't see you people, but Maria definitely can because the lights are. But there was a question here. There. Yeah.
Thank you. I'm Irina. I'm from Kiev. I represent women's organization, Political Action of Women, and I'm volunteer. And I know a lot about bulletproofs, about drones, but lots of Ukrainian NGOs change their work, especially women's organizations, and you mentioned about a local organization, and I would like to know more about your support of these organizations. How do you care about them? Because we now talk with donors that we have to support those organizations who support people. Do you have maybe some policy, or how do you support them?
Thank you. Do we have any other questions that we can take? Kanchi there.
Hi, I'm Kanchi. I have one question for each of you. For Christina, I was wondering if you could share your thoughts on the power dynamics between these sort of Western, in quotes, organizations setting up these anticipatory systems for use by traditionally conflict-affected, disaster-affected communities that are not normally in the West. And then for Catalina, I was wondering if you can tell us a bit about your experience with governments, also again, non-Western governments generally, areas with conflicts or disaster really, working on getting them to adopt these systems in light of currently very high needs. So how do you get them to put money in the piggy bank for next time when actually right now people are dying or whatever? So that's my two questions. And
But let's.
Yeah. You want to start?
I answer the, we can maybe switch. So the local support. So I think that as a Red Cross and Red Crescent like member for us, that is very important for us, because at the end the Red Cross and Red Crescent national societies are the national organizations that are out there that know the systems, the government systems that are auxiliaries of the government. So for us, that is a very important thing, how to make sure that all those Red Cross and Red Crescent national societies and the millions and millions of volunteers are supported, are ready to act. So there is a lot of work that has grown over the last few years on making sure that a lot of those national societies are able to anticipate better disasters, that the systems are better in place. So I think that's a lot of work. So that's, let's say, from the Red Cross side. Of course, there is another world of local organizations. And I think the key for all of us working in this space, and I think you in the Star Network are doing a great job on this, is like, how do we rethink our way of working to be able to truly support those organizations and work with them, and not that, I think you mentioned, Juliet, as well this morning, so it's not about the capacity building that we could do necessarily. It's like truly, how do we partner with them? How do we actually maybe take the decision of stepping out and let the organizations work? So there's a lot still to be done in that area.
Yeah, so on your question, so START Network as a systems change organization is focused on shifting power, resources, and practice in favor of locally led responses. So local organizations and locally led responses is the golden thread that runs through everything that we do. As I said earlier, we have a membership of now 140, will be 140 members at the end of the year. 70% of those members are local organizations across sort of these 10 countries that we're prioritizing. And, the way that we operate are through these hubs, which are sort of coalitions of local civil society groups leading, working together to come up with solutions to the problems that they see in their communities and in their countries. And what our role is as an international network is not only to provide services from the center, so my organization based in London helps these local organizations not only with funding, but also getting access to that funding. So how do we help, we do put them through a due diligence process. Depending on how they come out on that, they get access to different levels of funding. And then we help them shore up their financial system so that they can access even more, and then maybe one day access funding from donors that don't traditionally like to fund local organizations. So we try to do that. But we also provide services. We do trainings in how to do advocacy, how to fundraise. We connect those organizations with our donors to make sure that they have direct relationships. And looking into the system that we see that would be the system of the future, it is about working as networks, so working all together to help each other as peer groups, but also for the role of international organizations like START Network to really be service providers to local organizations, to be enablers of the local leadership to take place, not to do direct delivery all the time. So that's the way we do it. We're actually working now with one member in Ukraine on a local humanitarian fund in Ukraine, primarily to start looking at anticipating the effects of the conflict, primarily to start looking at how we can, through this fund, provide microgrants to local organizations in Ukraine to be able to do the work that is going to need to continue so that this doesn't become a frozen conflict in years to come. In terms of your question about how then that kind of power dynamic plays out in anticipatory action. So yeah, again, we try to root everything we do, even on the anticipatory action front, in local leadership. It doesn't always work, mainly because in a lot of the places where we're doing anticipatory action, the skills for some of this don't exist yet in local organizations. Local organizations don't have access to the government data. They were required to do things to model the risks well. And so we're trying to, and that's for all sorts of political reasons why governments don't share that information. So we're trying to help local organizations not only get access to the skills development to do this kind of work, but also the data to do this kind of work, and then again, the practice. So when we are working in a place like Somalia, for example, we have 8 local members in Somalia, and all of the work I was just describing in Somalia, a lot of it was done by those local organizations who work together with the INGOs to develop the contingency plans and then to operate them or to implement them once the money was triggered. But we don't always get it right. I want to tell a story in Pakistan a couple of years ago during those floods. What was it, 2012? 2020, the floods, 2022, I can't remember now, the catastrophic floods in Pakistan. We had a risk model that we had developed for flooding in Pakistan that was developed by a global agency. And when those floods happened, the model didn't trigger. Part of the reason why it didn't trigger is because we hadn't really modeled the right type of risk in Pakistan for that time. And part of the reason why we hadn't modeled the right risk, there was nothing wrong with the model, it was just modeling the wrong thing. And part of the reason why we'd done it is we'd relied on a global organization to decide what the risks should be. Now we've decided to actually operate through the local Pakistan Disaster Management Authority to make sure that the risk that we've modeled there now is very rooted in sort of local knowledge of what the flood risks are on an annual basis. So that's where we're really trying to get out of the global and into the local for a lot of that anticipation work that we do.
Cool. So I'm going to take the role of the governments and how they are kind of advancing and setting up the systems in conflict areas. So I think going back to the history, because again, it's not about the anticipatory action process, but it's about the early warning systems of the government. So all the governments agreed in 2015 under the Sendai framework that they will improve early warning systems. So that's already a commitment that they have. And many, many governments around the world, they have been trying to kind of really invest on particularly the forecast. That tends to be one of the big things that they mostly do. So there is really a baseline of a lot of work of governments really setting out the systems. Now, if we get into those conflict-affected contexts, that's a little bit of a different story because it's not necessarily the priority because the funding is not there. So of course they are less advanced on the forecasting capabilities. Why? Because of the issues that I mentioned before. There is no hydromet infrastructure. So they mostly relied in global models. So I think there are big gaps on that. But it's fascinating to see how over the last few years, a lot of those conflict-affected contexts are starting to rethink their capacities to do early warning and early action. And I think a couple of really interesting governments. Let's start with the Philippines, which of course has Mindanao. Philippines is the most advanced country. It's amazing. Philippines, when I was in the Haiyan response, it was they already had this calamity fund that was already used to do anticipatory action. It was great. But it was not working properly in Mindanao. It was a really big gap in Mindanao because it was just so complicated with all the different politics. So I think we saw the gap there. But they had an amazing financing system that they still have until now. Now, we have other governments like Somalia, which I think we really need to talk about Somalia in this context. Because I think what is happening politically at this moment is so important. So it's government that, of course, they know. They have been starting the 2011, the 2020, it's just never-ending crisis. And what the government has done at the moment, one, they appointed a director of climate change and food security in the office of the prime minister, who is an absolutely amazing guy, who actually we wanted him to come here, but he didn't come. And it's great. So there is actually a political position just at the office of the prime minister that is exclusively, well, not exclusively, but has a big agenda on early warning systems / anticipatory action. I think that's big. And just with the fact that Somalia is now one of the members of the UN Security Council, that also is opening a big political momentum. And the Green Climate Fund gave 100 million to Somalia now for climate action, which includes elements of early warning systems. So I see that. So there is a move and there is some progress. I think the big question mark is the setting up the systems, the really doing something that will make the big difference.
Sorry, go on.
I would say one thing about all that, the early warning and the early action and all this momentum around it at government level is fantastic. And you see it also at the World Bank, you see it in COP, places like that. But I also think and this is, again, from where I'm sitting, but I think the missing piece in all of this is the role of civil society. I think that a lot of these big movements are happening at government level. A lot of the big money is at government level. A lot of the moving around of the systems and the big conversations are happening government to government, leaving out organizations, civil society organizations that are going to end up doing the work and that are the ones that are going to be bearing the brunt of anything that's done politically. So I do think that civil society needs to be part of these early warning for all or, loss and damage conversations. They're never as squarely in the room as they should be.
which just brings me to one point, because I think so we have COP next week, and like we are going to be there together. And I know we're not that optimistic about this COP, that, you know, it's not going to be the most revolutionary one. But I think in this aspect of like bringing the conversation and the communities together is going to be important, because we have a lot of kind of sessions and discussions that are going to happen at this kind of like governmental level of how to do better early warning systems. But I think many of us are bringing the other side of the equation of like, and the role of the local organizations, and like, so I think that is something relatively positive of like bringing these worlds together. And I think in a way, yeah, I feel optimistic that I mean, it's not going to be revolutionary next week, but we will try to do something, at least in the positions where we are.
The civil society is something I wanted to actually ask about. Christina, you said before that that humanitarians are generalists, and we are kind of lacking some skills to actually meaningfully do anticipatory action. And my question is that what is the change that needs to take place within the humanitarian organizations? We have been talking about a lot about localization. This is a must. But do we, like, but what else? What do we need to change in our thinking, in the way of operating? Do we just need to hire a lot of like risk modelers from somewhere, or what else is needed?
Yeah, so I get really worried actually about anticipatory action becoming such a buzzword, becoming one of these agendas, these shiny objects, and all of a sudden donors are getting very excited about it, and I'm very excited about it. So, you know, it's not that it shouldn't be that, but what it does do is it creates a lot of noise. And it creates a lot of people glomming onto this agenda because there's, at the end of it, there may be funding. And to the point earlier about the role of local organizations and the power dynamics in some of this, you know, international organizations, knowing that local organizations don't necessarily have the right skills for this, they're taking this as an opportunity to raise more funds. And then what we do see, and we even see among our members, is all of these anticipatory action programs kind of springing up, and we're doing this in anticipatory action and that in anticipatory action, and even competing with each other, competing with us, all of this stuff. And you know, there's definitely a lot of enough work for all of us. But what I worry about is that the quality of the work that we're doing is really important. And you would know this better than I do, Catalina. This isn't a generalist initiative. Anticipatory action requires scientific data, academic knowledge of risk modeling, actuarial, you know, knowledge. Like it requires real specialists to get this right. And the minute we do not raise the bar on that quality, the minute we degrade that quality, our models aren't going to be right. We're going to trigger things that shouldn't be triggered. We're going to over-trigger in situations and spend money in the wrong places, and then the donors are going to turn around, or the community is going to turn around and say, see, told you so, anticipatory action was never going to work, and here's the proof that it isn't all that. And then that will kind of fade away. Whereas I do firmly believe that it is the most impactful and ethical thing to do. It will die out because we haven't maintained the quality of those interventions. So I do think it's not just a matter of hiring risk modelers into your organization, although I did say that we did that. It is really investing in this as a way of working, as a new, almost like a new business model, a new strand of work in your organization that takes the old response model and you know, keeping that, but then reformulating something completely different and really investing, you know, years. I mean, it takes us 2 years to develop a risk model. It's not a fast thing. It's taken us, you know, a decade probably to get to where we are today. So it's not something that just you can hire a few people and do anticipatory action because the donors love it. You have to invest in this, in the quality, in the personnel, and in the mindset shift that you need within your own organization. So I get worried that it's become so trendy to do this now because it could fall on its face pretty easily.
Yeah, I share the worry. And I do believe that anticipatory action has been one of the kind of greatest opportunities of collaboration outside of the humanitarian traditional kind of like sphere. And I think that's very powerful. So it is not really about having all the climate scientists and the modelers within the organizations. But I think what we have seen, which is beautiful, is that work with so many different backgrounds of people that are part of this community. So for instance, like 2 weeks ago, we had this what we call the Global Dialogue Platform and Anticipatory Action in Berlin. And like one of the things that I really like of that is that it's such a wonderful mix of people. So you have like the ultimate climate scientist that is like the expert and this like niche hazard. And then you have an anthropologist who is a specialist on the social science of early action. And then you have the governments, and it's quite special because it is about that. So I think it's about the power of collaboration and really trying to understand who plays a key role on the puzzle. But then going back to your point about the structural like issue that I think we notice is that we are falling into this rabbit hole of like each humanitarian organization developing their own system for decision making, and so each individually, so we have our own model and we use our own data and we have our own protocol. And that's really crazy. That's insane. Like, and I have been repeating this for years. I'm like, we cannot do that. Like, we really need to figure it out how to learn from the past, like how we set up the cluster system to actually learn how to collaborate and take joint decisions and apply that to the anticipatory action system. Because I think we cannot afford of being in a country like Somalia and then just each organization having their own triggering at the different times with the different data, with the different actions. I think we're seeing a little bit of that. I mean, we're trying to do better, but it's a critical issue.
Kind of, but then again, critical and nothing new under the sun in the same time, where everybody is doing. Okay, we have the last 3 minutes of discussion. We have been talking about the systems. Yeah, okay. I just heard sound, sorry. We have been talking about the systems in place, the systems that say that how is money well spent and how it's not well spent, the systems that sometimes might be rigid and slowly. We have been talking about not enough new systems, whether it's like financing systems or funding mechanisms or mechanisms on the ground. We have been talking about localization, about what we can prevent and reduce and what we cannot prevent. And we have been talking about expectations, how far anticipatory action goes and who can do what actually. And now I'm asking you, what do you think are the main 1 to 2 things the audience should take away from this discussion and never forget?
Okay, can I have 4? I've got jotted really down 4 as we've been talking, and I'll be really quick about them. So the first is impact before instruments. And I think talking to a humanitarian audience, you would really understand that. And it's particularly important in fragile states and in conflict settings where there's like all sorts of risks and vulnerabilities going on at the same time. We have to root everything we do in the impact that we want to have on communities. Whatever tool that is we use, whatever instrument we need to have that impact we use, but we don't choose the instrument before we choose the impact. With a lot of these financing mechanisms, everyone's like, I've got a pooled fund, I'm going to use a pooled fund. I've got a disaster risk financing mechanism, I'm going to use that. I've got a toolbox, I'm going to use that. No, look at the impact and then decide what instrument is best for that impact. That's 1. 2, sort of what you were talking about, Catalina. We've got to do this in concert. We have to do this together, both because we bring different skill sets, different risk profiles, different expertise to the table. But also we have to do it in concert so that we're coordinated and not stepping all over each other. When there's a typhoon happening in the Philippines, you can't have everybody assessing the typhoon in a different way and doing their triggering and their pre-positioning. We have to be singing from the same song sheet, otherwise we're working at a disadvantage. 3, we have to be locally positioned and globally connected. We start with communities. They do make the decisions. They do the risk modeling. They do the activities when the funds pay out. But we also have to be talking about this at global level to make sure this is a whole of society approach and that governments are in this with the Red Cross, with civil society, with the UN. And then the last thing is this mindset shift that I think we've been all talking about all day, that we have to get out of this response mode. And we have to ask ourselves every single time, why not anticipate? Is this predictable? Can we anticipate this hazard? And if so, let's do it. We have the science, we have the technology, we have the know-how, we have the tools to respond ahead of crises. So there's a moral hazard in there. If we decide to wait until suffering has happened to be able to do something about it, what does that say as us? Not only as a humanitarian community, but as governments, as people just living in this world where human beings are being put at risk all the time. We need to act ahead based on that knowledge rather than waiting for suffering to happen. Thanks.
Great. I'm so glad that you talk about the impact before instruments, because I wrote that paper with Claire Harris. So great.
Oh, that's
I agree. Yes, it was me.
collaboration.
Great. So, okay. So starting with kind of like the big picture, and I think this is not new to all of us, but I think it's important just to highlight the dimension of crisis that we will see in the future because of climate change and many other compounding factors is huge. So like we absolutely need to figure it out how to be better in the humanitarian sector to, do our work. I think it's huge. Like I was part of the IPCC AR6 report as a contributor author, and one of the areas of work that I did was looking into adaptation in conflict settings. And like one of the big things is that there is not a lot of adaptation going in conflict settings. There is not really enough early warning systems in conflict settings. That was a big, big thing, like in the framework of the IPCC report. So we do have the science, we do have the evidence that basically the crisis that is coming is really, really big, and the gaps that we have are huge. Which brings me to my second point, and I think we highlighted this quite a lot. So anticipatory action is not the silver bullet. Like it's just one piece of the puzzle. Like we really need to kind of like embrace that systems thinking approach in the humanitarian sector, and like how do we actually have all these different tools and these different kind of processes on the entire kind of like disaster risk management kind of like process. And I think that's so, so key. And we're a little bit far from it. And I think the other one, and that brings me to one paper that I wrote this year, which I was trying to identify the knowledge gaps on early warning and early action in conflict settings. And it was very striking to see that we have not a lot, I will say, but some investment on the hazard and on the forecasting side of things to be able to set up the systems, but there is not really a lot of like knowledge on the actual social science of it, or like what are the actions that make sense? Like what are the political processes behind the decision making? Like what are all these really important societal aspects that will help us to make sure that these early warning systems or anticipatory action systems are actually good. So that's like a big, big element. And then the last one, very important, and go back, I think this is not new, but I think it's just so important. In conflict settings in particular, that role of the local organizations is just so important. It's like no-brainer. Like it's really, for us, all of us working together to figure it out, how do we actually partner and really complement and support these local organizations that are the ones who actually know the conflict dynamics is super key.
Thank you. And thank you for being here for this discussion.
Thank you.
Thank you.